morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dimitris Pefanis. I'm the manager of CNN Greece, and I'm delighted to be moderating this very interesting and very thoughtful panel. I guess the title says it all. The title is A World Fragmenting. Can rule-based global economic cooperation be rescued? And I think that's a multi-billion-dollar question, given the turbulent times that we live in. And I guess we'll be having this discussion for the weeks or the months to come, given the fact that everything is changing, most probably on a daily or even on an hourly basis. So I would very much like to welcome this panel's member, starting with Oksana Antonenko, who is a professor at the European University Institute and UK resident. Luiz de Mello, if I get it correctly, who is a director of the country studies branch at the economic department of the OECD in France. Ulrik Vestergaard Knudsen, who is the chief corporate affairs officer at Netcompany in Denmark. And last but not least, George Pagoulatos, the ambassador and the permanent representative of Greece to the OECD in France. And I would like to say that this panel's programming partner is OECD. So I'd like to start right off the bat with the multi-billion-dollar questions. Can economic cooperation be rescued? Is it viable? Does it need to be amended? Or as we would say, it's totally over and done and we need to rethink how we cooperate financially from the beginning. And I'd like to start with Professor Pagoulatos for a brief overview, and then we can move on with the rest of the participants. George?
Thank you. Thank you. If I may start with a broad brush kind of outlook of where we are. I think it's fair to say that the world is becoming increasingly multipolar, but at the same time remains intensively bifurcated between two global superpowers and one trade superpower, which is the European Union. We have institutions which are the legacy of the post-war rules-based multilateral global system, the UN, the WTO, international treaties. They're increasingly irrelevant, ineffective, defied by major or even medium powers. The unity of the geopolitical West as we knew it is not what it was. It is challenged and not necessarily by its rivals. And this new world disorder is driven by geopolitics, but it is very much the result of geoeconomics, even though geoeconomics is not the most apparent version of that, in the sense that geopolitical rivalry between the US and China is the result of geoeconomic developments and the fact that globalization delivered China through trade in the position of a global superpower that is challenging the global supremacy of the United States. Now, we are at a time also where interdependence, which we have seen as a result of globalization, becomes weaponized. And of course, in the position of vulnerability are particularly countries with large trade surpluses, as we see today, because they can become subject to trade controls, tariffs being instrumentalized, also for the purpose of macroeconomic rebalancing, because one of the features of this world is that there are important macroeconomic imbalances that sustain this dynamic towards a kind of a forced rebalancing. And the most clear imbalances are the ones that concern the triangle United States, Europe, and China. United States needs to save more. Europe needs to invest more. It is exporting too much, investing not as much as needed, and China needs to consume more. This rebalancing could happen, optimally could happen through policy interventions of a more piecemeal type. It is now considerably forced as a result of tariff interventions. But what I would like to say, and I'll close my brief introduction, is that we are in a process which is moving. And it seems that we are in the beginning of the beginning and not anywhere towards the end. So when the tariffs were announced, analysts were keen to remark that tariffs in the US have reached the highest level that we have seen historically since the end of the 19th century, even higher than the tariffs in the 30s. I remind you that the tariffs during the Trump 1 period were that the average effective tariff in the end was 2.2%, which is not enormous. After the recent tariff round of reciprocal tariffs, they went up to over 20%, which is kind of end 19th century level. But clearly there's a process of de-escalation, there is a process of rebalancing. It seems that there is a dynamic towards an agreement, towards a deal, towards many deals in this world which is not rules-based and multilateral anymore, but is dominated by a more transactional logic and more bilateralism than we've seen in the past. So I say that because it's important sometimes to distinguish between what is the long-term trend and the kind of a blip in the future historian's radar screen. We're seeing a lot of noise. There's clearly a change in the long-term trend, but we might be exaggerating the depth and the structural extent of this change if we only look at the events and the statements and the rhetoric of the last few weeks and few days. It seems that things might be rebalancing and some element of cooperation is gradually returning to the system, and that is part my optimism, part my decision to try to be optimistic as much as I can.
Thank you very much, George. I think you've set up the stage perfectly and gave us a lot of things to discuss. Reading between the lines, I would say that your answer to the question is probably leaning towards a yes. It can be rescued, but I would like to ask Luiz again on, can you elaborate on the topic? Can it actually be rescued, given what George has said?
Thanks, Dimitris. And I think George really set the scene extremely well, and I wanted to pick up on his last point on the long term, on the long trends, right? The slow-moving, let's say, underpinnings of what we are going through now. The reason why countries cooperate is that they benefit from cooperation. Historically, that has been the case. And one of the reasons why they've cooperated so far, and hopefully they will continue to cooperate, is because of globalization, because of the level of economic integration that we are seeing in the world, and how it has evolved over time. If you look at a basic economic indicator, if you take, for example, the share of traded inputs, right, in our productions, so share of traded inputs in the whole output that is produced in an economy, those numbers have been rising, and have been rising steadily over time. There are periods in which they grow a bit faster, others where they grow a bit more slowly. So let's say the undercurrent, that is motivating globalization and hence the need to cooperate, they are there. If you look at other indicators, we tend to look a lot at trading in goods, especially given the developments of the last few weeks. But if you look at services, services have been growing very fast. Especially the type of trade in intangibles, if you want, which is what really matters for modern economies. If you look at data flows, if you look at professional services that are being carried out across borders nowadays, if you look at all these other parts of our economies that are really associated with innovation, technological change, that has been rising very fast. So my point here, and one could look at that, a very wide range of indicators that would point to in the same direction. So to go back to George's point, I think the long-term trend is one that we are observing, and it's one that should stay. So the reason for cooperation should stay there. That doesn't mean that it's not something that needs to be preserved, needs to be nurtured, and needs to be deepened, especially in moments of duress, which is the case right now. And the reason why, Dimitris, and I'll stop here, I think it needs to be preserved, is that policy uncertainty is probably much more detrimental to economic performance, to investment, to trade, to the ability of our firms to innovate, than many other aspects of policies. And we are seeing that all the volatility indicators that economists usually think about have grown very rapidly and very drastically over the last couple of months or so. So making sure that we can create an environment through cooperation that is more conducive to stability, predictability of rules in general would be a very important element to make sure that our economies start growing again. And why do we need to grow? Because if you look at the rate of potential growth in OECD countries over the last, let's say, quarter of a century, so to make it a bit more recent, that potential growth has come down for a number of reasons. And a lot of those reasons, weakness of investment, weakness of technological change, for example, that sustain the efficiency of our economies. One very important driver of that is policy certainty. So cooperating towards policy certainty so that our economies can grow more effectively, more robustly, because we need to grow more effectively, more robustly, is a very important element of the story.
So to paraphrase President Trump, quote, grow, baby, grow.
Listen, growth is a very important element in our story about sustaining living standards, right? Countries need to grow robustly, sustainably, on the basis of effective, intelligent use of resources that we have, and in a way that creates a lot of productivity. We had just a panel before that focused on productivity. Productivity is part of it. Productivity is efficiency. Efficiency needs stable rules, needs predictable policy environments.
Thank you very much, Luiz. And on the same topic, Ulrik, Luiz mentioned a lot about intangible assets, be it services or flow of information, and you are in this field and I guess you have a very thorough knowledge about that. Would that be a catalyst to actually preserve economic cooperation, or how do you see the broader picture?
Look, up until 3 months ago, I was also at the OECD, and I had the great pleasure of being colleagues with both George and Luiz, and it's good for my mental health to be surrounded again by their professional optimism. But they're both knowledgeable, optimistic, and indeed very professional. But I have to say also, not being part of the OECD anymore, I can perhaps be a little bit more candid. I can perhaps be a little more frank. And my professional optimism has probably evaporated a bit more over the last 10 weeks, to be honest. I think we need to be clear-eyed about this. The very pillars of multilateralism are under great attack. And as George eloquently mentioned in the beginning, it's not as if they were in great shape 10 weeks ago, right? I mean, we've seen this fragmentation. I totally agree about the multipolarity. That has been a long, hard blow to institutions like the WTO, IMF, the World Bank, and so on. But what we've seen over the last 10 weeks, and not least last week, is perhaps even more than that. I personally am afraid that this will be, if not a final blow, then an almost lethal blow to global international cooperation on economics as we know it. But I do not think that even Trump can kill globalization or the idea of open markets and free trade. So don't think it's the end of globalization. It's not the end of free trade, but it could spell the end of multilateral economic cooperation the way we've known it. We are entering a world that I would describe as transactional anarchy, and maybe we, slightly naive Europeans here on stage, will be the last defenders of the old world order, because the global south, if you can talk about a homogeneous global south, has already been transactional for decades, right? They have refused to choose sides between the democracies of the West, as we used to call it, it's also evaporated, and then China on the other side. So what's happening now is that the US is in a very blatant way also joining the transactional way of looking at the world, whereas we Europeans are left alone. And maybe there's a good niche for us there with our rule of law, our democracy, our freedom, our human rights, and praising all that. But I think we have to be a little bit more cynical at the same time as carrying that torch for these values that used to be Western values. So I cannot bring myself to say no, the system cannot be rescued. There's too much OECD in me still. But if you had reversed the question and asked me, is global economic cooperation in a historical severe crisis, I would definitely answer yes.
So more or less it's the end of the world as we know it.
Yes.
And we'll see what comes after that.
I mean, George said that we're only at the beginning, and we can just hope that it's not the beginning of the end.
And last but not least on this very interesting topic, Oksana, what's your point of view on this? And can we also add the elements of, it's not about just transactional economy, it's about geopolitics, it's about defense, it's about risk as well. And it all has added up in the last 10 weeks or so. So how does that add to the mix?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for adding me to the panel. I think I'm the only one who doesn't come from with the OECD DNA, so I'm here to challenge the groupthink, I think, on the optimism. So I'm someone who comes from working on risk for many years, and for risk professionals, we have a definition of optimist, somebody who believes that tomorrow will be better than after tomorrow. And I think we are very much in that mode today. So looking at what happened with the tariffs, I think tomorrow perhaps will be better, but after tomorrow perhaps not. So where are we now on the rules-based international economic cooperation? Well, first, the starting point, I guess, is that we no longer have agreement on the rules. And as was said by other panelists here, that is not a new development. We had for some time a situation in which there were a number of significant members of the international community who were trying to challenge and question the rules. But that was always done with the premise that we need to move towards reforming the system, not demolishing it. So they wanted to bring more equity, they wanted to deal with the issues of distortions, they wanted to empower more the emerging economies, but we are now in this unique, I think, situation for many years or decades or maybe even centuries, where we have the key beneficiary of that international liberal order is trying to demolish it wholesalely, not seeking to reform it, or tinker at the edges, but we've seen the United States, leaving the, World Health Organization, leaving the process of dealing with climate change, and of course challenging and imposing in a unilateral fashion the tariffs and other regulations which are profoundly damaging for the rules-based system. So in that sense, my conclusion is that we are not in a mode of reforming. We are in a demolition stage. And as I said, we now have the real estate developers' approach to global rules-based international order, where the real estate developers usually come to the site and start with demolition before they start actually building something new. And I think we are now in a demolition phase, which is really, incredibly challenging for us all. I think it is also quite challenging that we are for the first time seeing the situation in which the unilateralism prevails. And I think here I very much agree that in Europe, at least, we should all hold together as long as we can. But I'm not super optimistic that if we're really moving in the world of the, really aggressive trade war, protectionism, nationalism, particularly given the political dynamics within some of the EU member states. And we are not just only talking about Hungary here, we're talking about a number of other member states of the European Union who are about to have elections and are likely to see, more populist and far-right forces coming to power, that we can really maintain this unity within the European Union in dealing with this turbulence. And the final point, I guess, to make here also is that the economic coercion and anti-coercion instruments, we're talking about potentially using it from the European Union, is now becoming mainstreamed. And we, of course, are likely to see that happening, not only, in a kind of US context, but it's going to be a contagion all around the world. And we will see that, very serious impact on all the, major economies, including in the developing world as well. Perhaps later on I can cover your questions about the defense issues, which is of course very important. But maybe just one final footnote, maybe to say how the private sector is looking at that situation. And I think here it's very interesting that a few years ago, when we had a pandemic, when we had war in Ukraine and the impending sort of sanctions, restrictions, a lot of businesses felt that they were on their own. So whenever they went to governments, to international institutions in managing risk and raising their concerns about what they're seeing, they actually, usually the answer was, well, you know, we have this overarching, you know, crisis in which basically the business interests might have to be sacrificed. Now we're actually seeing the kind of rebirth of this nationalism with some kind of maybe positive tint to it, that businesses are now going to governments, going to international organizations, and seeking a way, you know, to manage risk cooperatively. And I think that is perhaps some positive development to the extent we can find the silver lining, because we all need to hold together to manage those, you know, challenges we face.
Thank you very much. And your point on demolition really struck on me. The actual question is, will it be a demolition period, or are we seeing demolition and then reconstruction? And what kind of reconstruction are we going to see in the foreseeable future? So during the first round of questions, we discussed globalization. And it's one of the words, the buzzwords that are very, very important and at the very center of our discussion. So, starting with George again, what is a possible future of globalization? Is it dead in the water? Are we going to see it transform? Are we seeing a new form of globalization in the next, say, years or decades?
Well, one thing is that globalization did not develop by decree, did not happen you know, from one day or the other. It took decades of gradual opening of the markets, starting from the early post-war period. The OECD was part of this creation. The European Economic Community was part of the process of opening the markets. And then in the 60s, the Kennedy round, and then various rounds that led us to the hype of globalization, the super globalization of the 90s and 2000s, which ended up with the 2008 crisis. And since then, we've been in the process that has been, some have called the slowbalization. So there is not a reversal of globalization, but there's clearly a slowing down, while a process of de-risking and relative decoupling is also happening, which has been driven by geopolitical concerns. And in this framework, we have been talking about fragmentation as well. Now, one of the elements of globalization is that it has been called to play in order to respond to what you have outlined, and Oksana mentioned it before, and Ulrik mentioned it, and I mentioned them both because they represent the more pessimistic part of the panel. Of course, Luiz mentioned it as well, that business leaders have a need, businesses have a need for a rational, predictable environment, that uncertainty kills production and economic activity. And it is through this process that rules have emerged and agreements have emerged and treaties have emerged that sometimes have been intergovernmental treaties, and the need to protect global public goods has emerged, and to build institutions that do the job, from climate to economic cooperation. One public good is global macroeconomic cooperation. We saw it with the Plaza Accord. We saw it after the 2008 crisis. We wouldn't have resolved the crisis without global macroeconomic cooperation. This is the kind of rationality that emerges in a system of global economic interdependence. The second element of that is that from the moment you have built this global economic interdependence, it's not easy to go back. Even if you erect tariff barriers, you cannot, I mean, there's not much reason in repatriating manufacturing, apparel industries from Vietnam to the United States, producing shoes or shirts, because they would either have to be produced at sweatshop salaries, wages, they will either have to be produced by robots, which will not create too many jobs, or they will be so expensive that middle class will not be able to afford them. So there is a point why we have been led to globalization, and that is the logic of comparative advantage trade and the pursuit of efficiency. Now, this doesn't mean that globalization doesn't need corrections. I mentioned one of the type of corrections, the imbalances, the global imbalances, some of which are not sustainable, have not been sustainable. But let me also say that globalization has been a system through which the United States has done very well. The United States is not a failed state or a failed economy. It has been the economy that has preserved its position as the global superpower, even though there's a rival power that has risen through globalization. It is the economy which remains the richest economy in the world, one of the most productive economies, the leader in technology and AI, and a number of other sectors, the most developed capital markets, providing opportunities for companies to not just start but also grow. And that you know, is not exactly the description of a failed economy. And of course, it's been running an economy that has been able to sustain high income levels and high living standards by consuming, by producing less than it is investing. And the current account deficit has been covered by capital inflows from the rest of the world, which are directed to the US because of the attractiveness of the US capital market, because of the opportunities, and of course because of the global reserve currency of status of the dollar, the US dollar. Now this is an architecture that has worked very well, as I said. It might not be sustainable if your levels of public debt, public deficits, and current account deficits are going over a certain level, but you can correct that without demolishing the whole global architecture. And it seems to me that this kind of rationality is now coming back after the reaction of the markets, after you know, seeing the effects of radical interventions play out in the real world. And after all, democratically elected politicians, they have two constituencies to address. One is the voters, and they need to speak to the concerns of the voters, and each democratically elected politician uses their own language to address the concerns of the voters, and the language in some cases is not the mainstream one, to put it diplomatically. And the other constituency is the producers and the people who do business and the people who create opportunities and wealth. And the US is not a global giant in manufacturing. Its dynamism is in digital and technology markets and services. And it seems that these also will be negatively affected if we move to a drastic deglobalization of the type that we might be seeing. So what I mean to say is to justify my residual optimism against the pessimism of Oksana and Ulrik and support Luiz in this discussion, that elements of the irreversibilities that global interdependence has been creating over the years and decades will be arising and balancing some of the excesses that we have been seeing over the last few months.
So in a nutshell, globalization will transform, but one way or the other, it will still be in the picture.
In the sense of global interdependence, in the sense of not going back to an autarkic world, not going back to the 30s or the end of the 19th century, yes, I believe that we will continue to inhabit a world that is considerably globalized, even though certainly not of the extent and the depth and the intensity of the globalization of the early 2000s.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to get back to Luiz on that. Do you share this optimism? And on a side note, what is your role as OECD in this picture and in the new environment? And how do you plan, or do you have already adapted your toolbox in order to cope with the evolving situation? I guess a new environment requires new tools and a new approach. How does that work for the OECD?
No, thanks, Dimitris. Let me double down on the optimism then, so that I can, you know, stay on George's side of the balance here. I think you're raising a very important point, Dimitris, which is, you know, where do we go from now and what? Oksana mentioned the word about reform, right? That is, so let me just put a point on the table that the experience that we have in talking to countries is that bad times are the best times to reform, right? To reform, especially when it comes to very difficult measures that need to be taken domestically, right? So a side of optimism here is that this could be an excellent time to make sure that countries do certain things that are in their best interest, that have to do with their own domestic policies, and that they haven't been able to do. Take, for example, Europe. We talked about Europe here. The completion of the common market, the whole competitiveness agenda for Europe, that there's no point in basically citing all the elements of it. But we know that this is a goal that we haven't been able to achieve fully for decades. Right? Making sure that in a world where there are pressures from the point of view of access to markets, that you can integrate your own internal markets so that your firms can upscale themselves, so that you can be more competitive and can be more productive and so on. It's something that can be catalyzed by difficult times, like the ones that we are facing now. So I would say this is a layer of optimism, again, an additional one, which I would say it's almost a spillover from an external context, that can force action on a domestic front. And again, take another case if you don't want to be too Eurocentric about it. Take Canada. Canada is a country with lots of barriers in terms of internal trade among the provincial territories in Canada. We've been documenting that at the OECD, discussing a lot with the Canadians about that. In a situation like now, making sure that all those pressure, all those barriers are dealt with, barriers that are of a regulatory nature, that are of other natures as well, that faster progress can be made there, is about making sure that you take an international context that is difficult to make important reforms at home. You mentioned the OECD. I think, Dimitris, that there are two parts of the work of the OECD that are crucial in this respect. One is obviously analysis, statistics, evidence, right? Sounds a little boring to say that evidence is important, but it is. In situations like the ones that we are going through, evidence is crucial. Making sure that you go to a negotiating table with well-informed elements that will then, help you cooperate or not, that will help you design domestic policies, is essential. So having forums, like many that exist in the world, where evidence can be produced, shared, best practices can be identified, I think that's core to our job, and that's something that is a contribution to this debate. Otherwise, cooperation will take place on the basis of opinion, not facts, not evidence. And then it's not well-informed policymaking, I would say. The other one is the efforts towards, on the basis of all this, come up with standards, come up with good practices, come up with lessons that can be shared among countries that are willing to participate in that discussion, and that can then be used to inform their policy decisions. Making sure that that translation, evidence, practices, experience, standards, is as widespread as possible is, again, a goal that is at the heart of what the OECD does. So making sure that we maintain those activities alive, that we maintain the momentum of some of the important discussions that are taking place, are very important. And instead of just, I don't want people to think that this is a very abstract thinking about this. Let me give you a very concrete example of how countries are already saving money on the basis of this. The OECD has a program that is over 40 years old that is about mutual recognition of data used in lab tests. This is non-clinical safety trials where countries that agreed on a certain number of standards to conduct those tests can share the data that is produced on the basis of that. That saves countries, according to the estimates that my colleagues have put together, about over 300 million euros per year in savings. So that's an area where cooperation on the basis of that link that I mentioned, evidence, good practices, standards, is already yielding very tangible gains that should be a very important element towards cooperation. So, making sure that this is alive, that if new geometries are needed to make sure that that is alive, is needed as well. So it's part of this evolution. It's part of this reform that we need to all get to together with a certain sense of common importance and common benefit.
So I guess it's a multi-level transformation, both for the outside world, but also on the inside for you as well.
That's right.
Oksana, let me get back to you and say, actually ask the question about optimism, given the fact that you see the things from the other side of the pond, but also double down on my initial question about defense, because I think defense is very crucial in this environment. How does it blend in?
Yes, I mean, first of all, maybe react a little bit on the OECD's importance. I certainly recognize that OECD has an absolutely critical role to play still in this very turbulent world. And I think on standards in particular, it's very important that we continue discussion about standards, because the biggest challenge we now face is that this minilateralism, which is going to emerge out of this fragmentation, is going to solidify into the economic blocks that are not only solidified by geopolitics and ideology, or maybe even political systems around it, but more important, the rapid divergence in standards. And we are seeing that already happening in front of our eyes, and this is something which will be much harder to reverse over time than simply dealing with the consequences of geopolitical tensions. So in that sense, discussions of standards and continuing to seek a way for harmonization of standards to the extent possible. And here, of course, US-China competition is going to continue to be very important. On defense, this is, of course, something which is now, at least in Europe, seen not only as an absolute necessity, given that, as we all discussed here, in this conference and many other panels, the fact that the Article 5 of NATO and generally the credibility of NATO's security guarantees are no longer should be taken for granted, not only as a necessity to secure itself, but it is also seen as a driver of new industrial strategy in Europe, that we are going to see more of a, greater investment in defense industry here, which is going to create jobs and opportunities, coming from UK. This is very much how Keir Starmer is presenting now, the need for investing more in defense, although the figures that he is talking about is really nowhere near sufficient compared to the needs. But here, again, the big challenge that we face is the need to pull together and to address this issue collectively, overcome this kind of national sort of priorities and constraints, to procure weapons jointly, to work on technologies jointly rather than on a national basis, to harmonize standards. We now in the European Union have, something like 14 armored personnel carriers, that none of them interact with each other or interoperable with each other. We have in almost every defense area, we have multiple standards that are not interact with each other. But it is a very challenging task. So the new Commissioner for Defense within the European Union, who now presented, Mr. Kubilius just presented an excellent new white paper, which talks about creating economies of scale, procuring jointly, procuring the equipment that we all agree on, but it will create winners and losers, as it always does. And I think it is also a challenge between creating the defense industry from scratch, which will take many years to mature, versus the time when we need actually to be ready, and therefore we need to have capabilities today or maybe even yesterday. So perhaps it is better for the time being to buy from the United States to be able to get those capabilities faster, but that is not something which is enjoying consensus in the European Union. So even though defense is the area where we're going to see growth, it is the potential for industrial growth, but it is something which is going to continue to face profound divisions.
So I guess the underlying word here is cooperation. Cooperation on EU level regarding defense, but also setting a roadmap for the future. Yeah. And last but not least, Ulrik, once again, the initial question about pessimism or optimism regarding globalization, but also I would like to put on the table intangible assets, namely technology and AI, which is very, very important. And given the fact that in multiple ways they cannot be tariffed, they're intangible, and we're discussing about global flow information, how important is the growth and development in AI and technology for the European Union? And in what way can we still be competitive versus the US or even versus China, who are appearing to be gaining an advantage in these fields?
I'm grateful for that question, Dimitris, because it means we don't have to end on a pessimistic note with me. And I want to also just underline that my pessimism was mainly, related to the global institutions, not so much globalization. I agree with George that it's going to be very difficult to kill globalization and the idea of cooperation, as you said, Luiz. And I would also always defend the OECD. I don't think evidence maybe is the most popular currency of political narrations at the moment, but that's even more reason for the OECD to thrive, even though I think we are in for 3.5 difficult years. But there is another engine of global and European growth. Globalization is not the only one. The other one is, as you mentioned, Dimitris, the digital transformation. So if we are entering a phase where globalization might not be accelerating as much as it did in the early parts of this century, we Europeans really need to seize the digital transformation. We need to embrace technology in a way we have, well, to paraphrase an often cited leader, like never before. We need to embrace the digital transformation. Otherwise, we are going to live in a digital world of tomorrow and the day after tomorrow as well, Oksana, that will be sort of painted or created in the mirror of Trump and Xi and Putin. So, in other words, there are 4 reasons, very important reasons, why Europe should seize the technological revolution, AI, as you said, the digital transformation more broadly. And the first one has always been with us, to make life easier and better for consumers and businesses, right? That's a no-brainer. The second one that has come into fashion, not least with the Draghi report, is that I think Europeans more and more have come to realize now that if we don't embrace this digital transformation, this continent will not be able to compete with the US and China, as you mentioned. We have in Europe for too long been sort of just hitting the snooze button, and then we said we snooze and then we sleep for another decade. We've done that 3 times now, but this time the wake-up call, the sound tone is so, discomforting that I think Europe is waking up. The third reason why we have to do this is geopolitical. We cannot, I think, take care of our own security. We cannot achieve the geopolitical clout we need in Europe if we don't have the economic growth to sustain it. In the long run, geopolitical clout, military independence is a function of economic growth. That's just the way it is. And then fourthly, and that has become even more important over the last 10 weeks, that's also where I started, the world in which our children and grandchildren are going to live is going to be increasingly digitized. It's going to be a whole different world than the one we're living in today. Europe is not at the forefront of developing that world, so our children and grandchildren are going to live in a digital world in the image of Xi and Trump if we do not get our act together in Europe. So those are 4, I would say, profound reasons for really upping our game when it comes to embracing technology and the digital transformation.
I guess we need to step up on this one. You said that you're not going to be very pessimistic, but I guess unless we do...
This is how optimism sounds in my voice.
Okay, so given the fact that we have something like 2 minutes, just a final comment and actually a rating, because I guess we all love numbers on this table. On a scale of 1 to 10, how, with 1 being the most pessimistic and the 10 being the most optimistic, what is your rate for the next, say, 12 months? Luiz?
Now the optimist is being more guarded here. I wouldn't venture into a number, but I would just say, Dimitris, that optimism without risk management is just wishful thinking. I think we've heard enough here that we need a lot of work to be done on the risk management side so that we can come out of a rough patch stronger and more resilient. So I would say that up to you to guess where I am on the scale after this, but I think we'll be fine.
Ulrik, am I getting a number from you?
Yeah, you are. You're getting 4 numbers. Geopolitical prospects for the US, 2.5, Europe, 7, China, 8, the world, 2.
That didn't sound too optimistic. How about you, George?
Good for Europe and China, I think.
I wouldn't be able to compete with the accuracy of Ulrik, but my optimism is based on the self-preservation instincts that the European Union has shown over the past crises. It's gone through a poly-crisis which turned into a perma-crisis. It has reacted to everyone, and today it is faced with an existential crisis for the European model. The European Union started as a geopolitical experiment, developed and grew and prospered through geoeconomics, and now it is faced again with this geopolitical moment that without responding, rising to the needs of the moment, it will not be able to preserve its prosperity and its position in the world and in the European way of living. So having said all that, I think I'm closer to 6.
At least it's a passable grade. And
Yes.
how about you, Oksana?
Well, I think 12 months is a very long time, as we all know. We've only been here for 2 months, so a lot can change. I mean, I tend to be very pessimistic in the short term, but more optimistic in the medium term. So I think for 12 months, probably close to 2, I would say.
Yeah. And that's being more optimistic than the current pessimistic?
No. Sorry. So 1 is the least optimistic, and the 10 is the most optimistic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm close to 2. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Better than 1, Dimitris.
True, but not a possible grade.
No.
So on this note, I would like to thank you everyone for this very insightful, albeit not very optimistic conversation. And hopefully in the next 12 months, the grades will be higher. And ask Dr. Abla Abdel Latif, if I got that right, the next panel's moderator, to come to the floor. Thank you very much.